mainstream media is talking about this counteroffensive. Finally, they're talking about this counteroffensive is not working for Ukraine. It seems to me that they're going to admit that it was a disaster. Do you think that the rhetoric is changing on the part of the West?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, the West doesn't want to give the Ukrainians any more money because, in particular, the United States hates losers. So right now, the Ukrainians are shifting from being winners to being losers. They're not being, and since the result for the Europeans too, is all about money. They're not a good investment. The odds are bad. So Biden went ahead and said, asked or is about to ask the U.S. Congress, that's fully expected, that the money to be sent to the Ukraine will now be spent arming Taiwan, which is also kind of a waste. But at least, grasping at straws, they see Taiwan as a better bet than the Ukraine at this point. Although Taiwan is also very iffy because Kuomintang, the nationalists, the party as a result of which Taiwan is politically separate from mainland China, the nationalists are about to get reelected, and they want to basically join the mainland peacefully on the same terms as Hong Kong. And the Americans will have this very strange situation where they have spent lots and lots of money arming mainland China. All of those weapons that they gave to Taiwan will be in mainland China's, will be in Beijing's hands and under Beijing's command. So, how dumb is that, really? Question is there anything at all they can do to avoid that? And the Taiwanese are not suicidal. As far as I can tell, they just don't want to go to war against the mainland, and they want to come to a peaceable arrangement with the mainland because that's where most of their trade is. They're not really separable at this point. And for the Chinese, both the mainland and the Taiwanese, trade is everything. Trade is what's most important. Trade is essential and military matters are secondary. So I think that the Ukraine is just going to get lost in the noise, but it may be one defeat too many already. After America pulls out and abandons the Ukraine, it may make Afghanistan look very, very minor.
It seems that the EU is not interested in absorbing Ukraine at all because they were talking about it's a huge burden for the EU. Let's assume that tomorrow this war ends. What would be the future of Ukraine?
Well, I think that there are certain parts of the Ukraine which will rather quickly decide that what they really want to do is join Russia. The process will not be instantaneous because Russia is already kind of full of former Ukrainian territories that it has to pave and rebuild and put in new pipelines and supply with water and train the people to operate according to the Russian standards, abandon their old Ukrainian ways. And so that process takes time. And Russia is investing heavily in all of that effort. If you look at the former Ukrainian cities, such as Mariupol, which were devastated by the Ukrainian military, they're being rather swiftly rebuilt. And, the tram service is running again, for instance. There are a lot of schools and hospitals and apartment buildings are being put up. And so they're becoming attractive. People are moving there. But the process takes time. So Russia will probably accept a lot of former Ukrainian territories on some interim basis. And it'll be a bit of a contest between who gets in first, because they'll have to play it right and make themselves attractive. But they will certainly be denied to whatever remains of the Kiev regime. I don't know how much of it is going to be left, because it's all based on stealing money. If no money is coming in from the West, there's no reason for them to stick around. They can just go and live off their savings in Miami or the Maldives or wherever. They bought a bunch of mansions in Switzerland. I guess they're planning to move to Switzerland, and I suppose that's going to be the pattern. Now, the only country that is interested in any part of this, other than Russia, seems to be Poland. But Polish politics is one of those completely ridiculous things, and has been for centuries now. Polish nationalists have absolutely ridiculously large appetites for rebuilding what they see as their former glory as a Polish empire, you might say. But that's many centuries ago, and modern Poland has absolutely no hopes of ever achieving even that sort of notoriety again, never mind success. So what happened recently is basically Putin gave them a lecture on history, trying to talk them down, because the Polish nationalists are not the only people there. There are lots of Poles who actually aren't opposed to Russia and aren't really interested in some kind of a major war, major military conflict. They aren't really interested in merging and melding with the Ukrainians that are already there. You know, they had the largest number of Polish refugees, none of which, or very few of which, are willing to go back. A lot of them aren't willing to work either. They're waiting for handouts. And so that is not something that your average Pole particularly likes. And so this effort by Putin to talk sense to them, I don't know how many of them actually heard it, but I wouldn't be surprised if the message actually sinks in. Chances are that they will basically form some sort of opposition that will put a limit to the nationalists' desires to absorb Western Ukraine, or whatever remains of it.
Poland was one of the countries that, when this war started, they were totally in for supporting Ukraine. And it seems that this vision is changing in Poland.
Well, I can understand that the Poles were initially with the Ukraine, because that part of the world, that entire former Eastern Bloc, it tends to be quite anti-Russia. They formed an image of the Ukraine from the late Soviet Union, when everything was breaking down and nothing worked. They very much absorbed the anti-Russian lesson that was being presented as part of perestroika. And they, of course, couldn't help noticing the complete disarray and the mafia crime wave that gripped Russia under Yeltsin, and the disorderly and criminal privatization by a group of oligarchs. They don't really understand what Putin has been doing for the past 20 years, and they don't understand that Russia is changed. It's a transformed country. They also expect that, well, the Russians might come back and give them, basically start offering them things, because the Russians have built a lot of things in the East Bloc nations. They supplied them at the expense of Russia itself. You know, they built a lot of factories. They provided education to a lot of people. The Russians basically sacrificed themselves to build up these countries. So there is a kind of an ingrained expectations that the Russians are going to come back and kind of like beg to be friends again, beg forgiveness, and provide another handout. And it's a bit of a shock to them that Russia is in its current place is very, very hard nosed when it comes to business. It is quite possible to do business with Russia, but if you think that you're going to somehow um, gain an advantage, unfair advantage, or, engage in profiteering at Russia's expense, or run your own corrupt scheme, financed by Russia, forget it. That's not going to happen. So that's a little upsetting to them, I suppose, to their elites who remember how things were done in the old East Bloc, where the Russians basically footed the bill and got insulted in return. That's not going to happen anymore.
When this war started, there was a debate between Sikorsky and Michael McFaul on one part, and the other part, there was Professor John Mearsheimer. They were discussing this war in Ukraine. Sikorsky there showed tremendous hate toward Russia. And when he was talking about Russia, he said that we all know what Soviet Union did to us. But it's why they're talking about Soviet Union. This is not Soviet Union. It's Russia.
Well, because Russophobia is his and his wife's, Mrs. Applebaum. That's their stock and trade. And that's what they've been selling for years now. They don't know how to do anything else. Russophobia is their whole thing. If they had to learn something else, their brains are probably too old. And so they keep repeating the same old Russophobic lies because that's the only thing they have. They can't come up with anything else. They're not really in touch with what's happening in Russia. The people that they talk to, the Russians that they talk to, are basically traders. And Russia is a big country that has some number of traders, and it's a relatively liberal place. So for a while there, the traders were free to go. If you leave the country, that's fine. Out of sight, out of mind. So there are a lot of these Russian emigres who have accumulated in the United States and in Western Europe, who have made money by telling the Westerners and the Americans what they want to hear about Russia. And what these people want to hear about Russia is uniformly bad. Russia is corrupt, Russia is weak, Russia is falling apart. All you have to do is touch it and it'll crumble. Those were a lot of the false facts about the sanctions from hell, which turned out to be from hell for the Europeans, not the Russians, because the Russians got a lot of industry that they got back because foreign interests left. And so, yeah, that's Sikorsky and his wife and their ilk. I can understand. You can almost feel sorry for them at this point. They're lost. They're just in a world of their own.
By making this rhetoric, we know that right after that, cancel culture came in action against anything Russian. They were canceling everybody all around the world. Anything it's just a little bit Russian should be canceled. How do you see this movement that started against Russia and Russians?
I don't think it matters all that much, except for the Russians who pretend that it's not real. There are some Russians who are in denial, who are used to thinking of, how nice it is to walk down Champs-Élysées and drop by, stop at a cafe and drink a cappuccino and eat a croissant, and what a nice place France is. And so they have a lot of trouble realizing that the world have changed forever, that Russia is actually a very nice place, very comfortable, very safe, prosperous. Whereas France, Paris is full of people basically going into revolt mode all the time. Rubber bullets and tear gas all over the place. There are piles of rotting garbage all over the place. I don't know if they've cleaned that up yet, but it was pretty bad for a while. And as a result, lots of rats. And that basically Western Europe is becoming rather distressed, impoverished, very unsightly, unsanitary in a lot of ways. They still have this image of a very nice and prosperous Western Europe, which will probably never come back. But it's very hard to convince people. They basically, the image of Europe and European culture and all of that will probably die out in the countries where it's from, and will only continue in Russia itself. It'll be a sort of European refuge, if you will.
You know, one of the things that I noticed throughout history of Russia is a very important line between East and the West. That's why United States didn't want Russia inside the EU, inside NATO. Russia is so big, so powerful to be part of NATO.
Well, it has to be understood that Russia is not the West and it's not the East. It's its own civilization. It's the North. It's the civilization of the North. It has lots of territory and millions of people living where nobody else could possibly survive. No other nation could actually inhabit such harsh climates and be healthy and happy there. And for that is that Russian civilization is very different from the West. It's not competitive, it's cooperative. People have to help each other because the alternative is death. And you realize that as soon as you get out of the big cities, which are same world over, I suppose, but in a lot of the smaller places, and even the people from the big cities, they immediately switch into a different mode. You can't pass somebody who needs help. You have to help them. And that is universal. Communities are tight by necessity. They can't treat each other as strangers. You can't say, these are my kids and these are your kids, and they might play together a little bit, but we're not really going to take responsibility for each other's kids or help each other bring them up. Any of that, those are boundaries that we can't possibly cross. That doesn't work in Russia. You know, a kid is everybody's kid. And children in Russian villages and small towns, they walk around, they talk to everybody. Everybody talks to them. The whole place is relatively safe that way. Everybody looks out for each other's children. That's perfectly normal. In you know, it's kind of a new thing that if you if you spank somebody else's kid who behaves badly, that is now a bad thing in Russia. That is big news to the Russians in many parts of Russia, still to this day. You know, that's a no-no in big cities now. But in the smaller towns, everybody brings up each other's kids, punishing them if necessary. So it's a different civilization.
We have this race in the United States for the presidential election. We have Trump, we have RFK Jr. John Bolton recently predicted that if Trump gets elected, he's gonna leave NATO. Do you think, is there any meaning for his prediction?
I think he makes a lot of noise, but not very much sense. I don't think it's up to Trump whether NATO stays together or not. After the failure in the Ukraine, NATO is basically defunct. You know, it has no purpose. All that remains is for Russia, you know, to deal at a coup de grace, is to basically walk over some country that happens to be in its way. could be Lithuania. Lithuania has been rather nasty in blocking traffic between Russia and Russia and Kaliningrad, the Kaliningrad region. That's an annoyance. Now, the fastest route from Russia to Kaliningrad goes through Vilnius and Kaunas, the two largest Lithuanian cities. So that would take Russia maybe a week, maybe 10 days to basically secure them, make sure that the traffic goes through. And I guess Lithuania will then have a government in exile living on the shores of Lake Geneva and trying to make as much noise as possible, trying to get NATO to agree to liberate their two largest cities from this Russian invasion. And guess what? Is anybody going to go and fight for Lithuania, do you think? Is anybody going to stand up to the most powerful military that just vanquished the Ukraine and NATO with it for the sake of Vilnius and Kaunas? I mean, a handful of people have heard of Vilnius. Just about nobody has heard of Kaunas, and if you dig deep enough, Vilnius is actually, for a while, it was Vilno, and it was Polish. So who cares whose it is, Polish, Russian, Lithuanian, what's the difference? If the Russians want it, they can have it. We don't want a third world war because of Vilnius and Kaunas. And after that, NATO will pretty much fade away. So it's not really up to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has already said that NATO is kind of useless, but that he'll keep it around if NATO members pay the Americans more money for American-made weapons. And a lot of some of the Europeans, not so much the Germans, but definitely the Lithuanians, complied with his demand. Of course, it won't do Lithuania any good when the time comes. Its military is nothing. But at some point, Trump will decide that, this is all just completely useless. This is a farce. Let's end it. But it'll end whether or not he says that.
It seems that the conflict between Belarus and Poland is getting worse. What's the problem between them?
Poland wants a piece of Belarus. Again, these lands, the boundaries shifted back and forth quite a lot over the years. And at some point, Poland to the west, now Western Poland, and bigger to the east. So some of the now Belarusian and Lithuanian lands were part of Poland. I think after World War II and even before that, it shifted further west. So the Poles want to keep their German lands and gain their Belarusian lands. That's not going to happen. So that's basically, some kind of phantom limb that the Poles are still, the Polish nationalists are still feeling. That's still hurting them, but that's about all it is. The recent developments is that Belarus got Wagner, the PMC Wagner, which is training Belarusian troops based on their Ukrainian experience, basically getting the Belarusian military up to snuff. And Belarus now has nuclear weapons, thanks to Russia. So it's unassailable. It is not at much of a risk of any sort of a Polish invasion. And the mindset of the Belarusians is that they'll stand every square centimeter of their ground, whereas the mind of the Polish leadership is very different from the mindset of your average Pole who does not want to fight. In fact, when there was some sign of a military escalation, a lot of Poles who, after all, have EU passports, just basically moved out of the country before they could be rounded up and sent to some sort of senseless slaughter somewhere.
These negotiations in Saudi Arabia, they were talking about the war in Ukraine. At the end, there was no declaration, no final declaration, and it seems that nobody cared about Zelensky's peace plan. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, everybody, I think at this point understands what Russia's position is. All you have to do is read Chapter 5 of the Russian Constitution, and you'll realize that these former Ukrainian territories are now Russia's sovereign lands. So no Russian leader and no Russian official is going to violate the Russian Constitution in any peace negotiation. Those lands are non-negotiable. Furthermore, according to the Russian Constitution, they incorporated those lands in the borders of those regions as officially declared prior to the conflict, which means that the Ukraine is actually occupying some part of Russian territory as opposed to vice versa. So the Ukrainians are going to have to leave the territories that they currently occupy. And that is also a non-negotiable stand. So given that, the absolutely preposterous announcement made later by organizations such as Bloomberg that the participants agreed to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Ukraine is absolutely preposterous. It's a non-starter. It's not about anything, really. So what went on at that meeting is not widely publicized, but the people who did pay attention basically realized that it was a severe pushback to the American initiative to get everybody behind some peace plan that would ignore the interests of Russia. By now, everybody in the world, except maybe the Europeans and the United States itself, realizes that the interests of Russia are not going to be ignored. And so the meeting broke up amicably, having decided absolutely nothing.
Do we know what exactly this Zelensky's plan was?
Well, it doesn't really matter. Zelensky is basically out in the weeds. And right now, the Americans and the people that the Americans control in the Ukraine are deciding, it would appear, are deciding the best way to get rid of Zelensky. Perhaps the best plan is to send him to the front and have him catch a stray sniper bullet and die as a hero. That would be a wonderful plan. The stray sniper bullet would probably come from an American special services person, not from a Russian, but it would look good. He would be heroic. He would die as a martyr, etc. So that is really the Ukraine's plan, not anything that Zelensky has proposed.
We have this BRICS summit, and 67 countries were invited in this summit, and no invitation for Macron. How do you see the importance of this BRICS summit? Because Lula said just yesterday that the BRICS banks exist to help save countries, not to sink them, as the IMF often does. How do you see this, his comment, and the importance of BRICS summit?
Well, the reason everybody is rushing over to join BRICS or to somehow interact with BRICS, to get on the list, etc., is because they're very interested in this new plan of not trading in euros or dollars, because they know that these currencies are doomed, that they know that they would be the losers if they continued to trade in these currencies. And it's a difficult problem that China and Russia and the other BRICS members are solving. The central banks are buying up gold, which will be the reserve, and then there will be currency swaps arranged if any imbalances develop, they will be settled by an exchange of gold, perhaps only on paper, because the gold will still remain in some vault in Russia or in China or in one of the other key BRICS members. So that is really the plan, and that is what everybody is, trying to join. Now, the Westerners have this completely false take on it. They think that there'll be a new BRICS currency that they'll be able to buy into. Well, no, it will not be open to speculators. It just won't be. It will be open to central banks and to the nationals in those countries. So basically, it will remove the wall between member countries and between countries that want to cooperate with them, while throwing up a wall between them and Western speculators. It will not be a tool for Western speculators to get in and manipulate and steal people's savings, and etc. And so everybody's very interested in that, and that's why we have such a high level of interest. The reason, for instance, Putin is not attending, I don't know about any other heads of state, is that things are getting technical. It's no longer a vision thing, it's an implementation thing. Everybody knows what the gold bricks are in BRICS. They're gold bricks. Everybody knows that they have to get their gold reserve, physical gold reserves up, and get them out of jurisdictions, Western jurisdictions, out of their hands. Everybody's trying to do that.
One of the biggest problem of the West in this war in Ukraine was the sanctions didn't work for them. How these sanctions are contributing to de-dollarization?
What the sanctions are doing is basically stealing Russia's money and stealing the money of the countries that want to trade and cooperate with Russia. And nobody likes to have their money stolen. So basically, de-dollarization is driven by the desire to minimize this level of theft that is affecting national trade, that is depriving countries of their export revenue, and that is complicating trade by introducing layers of middlemen. So, for instance, if you want to buy something on eBay from Russia, well, there's no problem with that, except it has to go through Kazakhstan as a transshipment point, or Armenia, or some other place that is willing to become, the middleman. And then the United States goes after them for, breaking sanctions, and they get sanctioned, etc. So after a while, nobody wants to do business with the United States.
The director of the German chemical manufacturer said that the industrialization is beginning in Germany. Prices are going up and profits going down, and huge damage in long term. What were the effects of these sanctions on the Germany's economy, in your opinion?
Well, it's going down, down, down. That's obvious. They basically sacrificed their industry in order to keep the household supplied with electricity, heated, etc. And they did that successfully. The Americans were happy for a while because they got to charge a lot of extra money for liquefied natural gas. But that little pulse of profit seems to have run its course, because Europe is kind of broke. It doesn't really have the ability to continue importing gas at such exorbitant rates. The households are broke. People are resorting to not heating, basically living in the cold. Nobody likes that anymore, and that is going to cause a political explosion in one place after another. Europe is not too far from it at this point. And so industry has had to shut down. So, for instance, one of the key segments, industrial segments, in Germany, is car production. And it's pretty much shut down. All of these old, very respected companies with high quality products such as BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, they are pretty much shutting down. They're very close to bankrupt. And China is now the largest car producer in the world. It just went ahead and replaced Europe. And this is what's happening because now industry can move very quickly from country to country. There are really no barriers to it anymore. So as soon as Russians lost the ability to import European cars, they instantly switched to importing Chinese cars and started ramping up domestic car production, which they didn't have to bother with before, being quite happy with BMWs and Mercedes. But now suddenly they're making quite respectable domestic cars. And recently, Putin announced that all government workers and officials have to buy domestically made cars. They have to. Somebody tried to buy Citroën instead, lost his job.
We know that one of the problems that Germany is facing was this sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline. It seems that still one or two of these pipelines can start working.
The threat is, well, just try to restore this trade with Russia and natural gas, and we'll blow up the remaining pipelines. What's to stop us? You know, you have to understand that at this point, the United States is just completely shameless when it comes to that. And the problem with Germany breaking with the United States is that it's an occupied territory. You know, since 1945, the Americans have never left. You know, Germany is still under American military control. It does not have proper sovereignty, and it cannot decide what to do internationally without the consent of the Americans. So I think that Germany is going to continue going down, down, down. There's nothing to save it.
If you remember, right after the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, it was announced that there is a new pipeline between Norway and Poland. If you were a politician in Germany, I think they have to think about it. They were betrayed by the United States and Poland, because Germany was a hub for energy in Europe. Now is losing that, and everything's coming from Norway gonna be much more expensive than what they received from Russia.
I believe the bigger problem there is quantity, not even price, but quantity. The Norway Poland pipeline is tiny and is therefore insignificant. So yes, it was sort of a slap in the face, but it's a rather ineffectual one, I would say. And you know, the truth of it remains that pipeline gas can only be obtained in Europe via Turkey. That's it. And Algiers for southern Germany. You know, that's a major hub. And the rest of it is liquefied natural gas, which is generally more expensive. But not only that, but depending pretty much on whim, it can be redirected to Southeast Asia at any time. And the Europeans are in no position to outbid Southeast Asia, which is quite warm and uses liquefied natural gas for industry, not for house heating, pretty much, except maybe in the north of China. So, you know, the Southeast Asians are much more successful in making good on the higher priced gas than the Europeans. They're far more competitive. So Europe is really very much in a tight spot as far as energy, and specifically as far as natural gas.
Right after that, we heard that there's going to be a hub between energy hub in Turkey. Putin was talking about this. He's gonna cooperate with Erdogan in Turkey to make a hub of energy in Turkey. And right now, just yesterday, I saw in the news that they're gonna be a hub between Russia and Iran. How do you see these policies of the Putin administration?
Well, he wants to ensure that there are export markets for Russian product. And Turkey, because there are already pipelines to Turkey and there are existing relationships which are quite reasonable. Turkey and Russia cooperate quite well. Turkey is a good candidate. Iran is also a good candidate. There are many new developments involving Iran. And one of them is the north-south corridor that'll go from Russia through one of two routes, then through Iran. The railroad links are already being worked out to Pakistan, and then by sea from Pakistan to India and Southeast Asia. So that is a big new move. And that is generally part of Russia turning eastward and away from Europe.
You talk about Pakistan. What happened to Imran Khan in Pakistan after this war in Ukraine? He decided to be neutral in this war. Then right after that, there was a coup against him. How did you see that?
Well, unfortunately, Pakistan is a very conflicted place with lots of different conflicts and ambiguities and holes in its sovereignty. So it is riddled with CIA agents. It has a running conflict with India that, in spite of both of them now being part of SCO, can be heated up, can be provoked at will. They know that. They have basically an open, porous border with Afghanistan. And those are all complications that make it very vulnerable. So Imran Khan, I suppose you could say he made a mistake of right after Putin announced his special military operation in the Ukraine, flying to Moscow and basically trying to cement ties with Moscow. In spite of this, and from the point of view of Americans, that was unforgivable. So that was the point where they basically deployed all of their money politics in order to destabilize Pakistan politically, get Imran Khan thrown out of office and replaced with someone more obedient. And it's a great shame that Pakistan has found itself in such a sad situation.
He said that Pakistan was part of the Cold War, and now we are not interested in participating in this new Cold War between the United States and Russia and China. He wants to have good relations with the United States, with Russia, with China, with everybody. But it seems that the people, the politicians in the United States are not tolerating that.
Yes, well, in particular, not even the politicians per se, but the security state, which is really beyond the power of even presidents, wants basically to maintain a conflict with Russia because they make money from it. And so that is a detriment to preserve this conflict. And they will do everything they can in order to thwart it.
And we have this new crisis in Africa, especially in Niger. In your opinion, what's missing in Africa? What they're looking for?
They're looking for the Soviet pattern of development, not the European or American pattern of development. The difference between the two is that the Europeans and the Americans will roll in with their own people, with their own companies, exploit the resources, export them pretty much for nothing, pay off the local elites, basically corrupt them politically, ignore the local people, and once the resources have been produced out, they leave. And that has been the pattern with everybody from Saudi Arabia, where basically Saudi Aramco is staffed with foreign engineers, not Saudi engineers, to Niger, where the French basically make some pretense of employing locals, but really it's all French, it's all French owned, and they treat it as their property. Now that's the Western pattern of quote unquote development, whereas the Russians, when they start working with a country, they want that country, its own people, to develop their own resources to their own benefit. So they build schools, they build hospitals, they build sports arenas. The schools operate in a way that allows the most promising students to go to Russia on full scholarship and learn a profession or a trade, and then go back to their country and practice it. There are systems of apprenticeship for people who want to work developing the country. And so when the Russians develop a country, they develop the people of the country, not just the natural resources. And Africans want that. They want that model. They don't want some white master swooping down on them, robbing them, and then leaving them with nothing. You know, it's been the pattern in Africa that when the white people leave, suddenly all sorts of things start failing. You know, power goes out, desalination plants stop running, because none of the locals know how to run this stuff, because they haven't been taught, because it hasn't been seen as necessary. The pattern has been pay off the elites among the locals, the little local kings, etc., corrupt them, and leave the rest of the country in a lurch. If that starts failing, then start arming different groups against each other, provoke a civil war, and then once that's run its course, then you can go back in and continue developing resources as before. And none of the Africans want that anymore.
We know that Victoria Nuland is there in Niger. They're trying to negotiate with these military commanders. If I'm not mistaken, there are 7 US military bases in Niger. I don't know if they were expecting this coup in Niger or not, but it seems to me that they couldn't do anything about it.
I don't think it can actually do anything except fly drones, which are, well, if you want to assassinate people, sure, but other than that, I'm not sure what they're good for. And there was even a skirmish, a military skirmish between the Nigerian military and the French, a border skirmish. The French actually invaded. I don't know how far that's going to go. And the big fear that the Europeans and the Americans have is that Niger has struck a deal with Putin. And if things get a little bit out of hand, then suddenly Wagner is going to show up. And then everybody will run for their lives, because at this point they're so scary that nobody really wants to mess with them at all. Also, it must be noticed that a lot of the neighboring countries are on Niger's side. And the various other countries, like Nigeria, that are on the west side are so ridiculously corrupt that it is unlikely that they're going to actually put something effectual together. Yeah, they'll steal the money that's allocated to the purpose, but who knows whether anything will come of it.
Japanese Prime Minister and Hiroshima mayor, they were at this anniversary of the nuclear bombing, and they didn't even mention that it was the United States that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and not mentioning anything of the US. Right after that, they were talking about their fears of Russia if they want to use nuclear weapons. It's so amazing that this is a country that was a victim of this nuclear bombing. Now talking about Russia using these nuclear weapons. Russia has no history of using nuclear weapons and doesn't need to use them. What's your take on this?
Well, you have to understand the shape, the state of Japanese society. They're technically relatively well trained because they're obedient and they try hard. So basically, they're like ants rushing around doing whatever they have to. They're terrible at group decision making because of the stiff hierarchies they have. And they're extremely ignorant of history and of the outside world because they don't read. You see, very few Japanese actually read. They read comic books. That's about it. That's the main reading that even quote unquote educated Japanese businessmen do. Books for them are something relatively alien. And so they're very easily fooled, and as Americans have done. And so America has been Japan's enemy, but it is being presented as a friend, whereas Russia has tried quite hard to be Japan's friend in spite of everything, but it's being painted as the enemy. So for instance, 0% of Japanese know that Hokkaido is Japanese because the Russians, after conquering it, handed it back voluntarily. Instead, they're being told that Russia is occupying some islands north of Hokkaido, and the Japanese want them back, even though it's pretty much cut and dried in treaties that the Japanese have signed or have refused to sign, what the fate of those islands are going to be. Furthermore, they're Russian sovereign territory, so there's absolutely no use asking for it. They also don't know history very well, so they think that they basically surrendered to the Americans, and the theatrical production involving General MacArthur on board a ship with the Japanese emperor signing the terms of surrender. They believe that that was the actual thing. That's what ended the war. They're not taught that the war was pretty much lost when the Kwantung Army was defeated on the mainland by the Red Army, that they were basically forced to retreat at about the rate that the Russians could actually advance. It was limited by the speed of the Russian equipment than by anything else. There was pretty much very little fighting going on after a while because the Japanese were routed. They're not taught that at all. They're not taught about the atrocities that the Japanese committed in Korea and in China. They're not taught about the rape of Nanking and various other atrocities that they committed. So they don't really understand why it is that all of their neighbors pretty much hate them. They're at a loss. So one can only pity them at this point. One can only pity them.